Hello, hello, and welcome to the Good Girls Get Rich podcast. I'm your host, Karen Yankovich, and I'm so excited about this week's show. You know how big a deal I think it is when you're in some kind of transition in your life and your business, and you're feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome. You're feeling a little bit like a newbie, even though you probably have 20 years of expertise in what it is that you're doing as you move into your next chapter. And I think publicity and PR is the answer to the credibility that you're seeking. Well, one of the ways that we teach that in our She's Linked Up Accelerator programs is by creating a system to use LinkedIn to help you build relationships with podcast hosts so that you can get featured on more podcasts. And it's a way to get in front of their audiences. And it's what makes your marketing magnetic, right? Because if they've invited you on their show, then you get to borrow the credibility of the host a little bit. So Kimberly Spencer, who's our guest for this week, is an expert at this, and she's created a whole business around this. So I have a lot of questions for her, and I know that this is going to bring you tons and tons of value. So I'm going to bring Kimberly on, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about her. Hey, so happy to have you here.
So honored to be here.
Well, let me kind of just read your bio. And tip number one from somebody that really knows what they're doing with podcasts. She sent me this 3-sentence bio. I'm like, she knows her stuff. Kimberly Spencer is an award-winning high-performance, trauma-informed coach and trainer, Amazon best-selling author, TEDx speaker, and the founder of crownyourself.com and the CEO of Communications Queens, helping visionary leaders transform their self-limiting stories, build their empire, stand out fearlessly, and create a body, business, and a life that rules. I love that so much. So thanks for doing this. Thanks for doing this today.
Oh my gosh. Of course. It's my pleasure. And I have to practice what I preach. So
yeah, right. And
integrity,
it's
right?
so interesting. It is. And, I can tell you that and probably you, the more you do, the more you get asked to do, right? So I do get opportunities where people come to me asking me to be guests on their shows. And I love that because that's part of the magnetic strategy that I want my clients to also experience. But it's not enough. I want to have a strategy, and I have a pretty hefty commitment to guesting on podcasts because I have absolutely had, 20, 30, 40, $50,000 months after being a guest on particular podcasts. And so when you see that, I'm like, okay, well, I want more of that, right? Because that's business that kind of, again, it's that magnetic business, right? I get to borrow your credibility if I'm on your show and you're saying, hey, y'all need to listen to Karen, right? So it's such a big part of the strategies that we teach because it can be simple and it can be done in a way that is not spammy. Right. And so tell us a little bit more about you because your bio did talk about a bunch of different things that you do, but tell everybody a little bit about your perspective on how you came to wanting to talk about and teach about and focus a part of your business on podcast guesting.
Yeah. So like any normal person, when I had my second baby, I thought, why not have a second business? And it was... And it was because
right. I'm not sleeping anyway. So why not take some time to,
just build something new. So I've had my coaching business now for 9 years, Crown Yourself Coaching. And I've been coaching and working with high performance visionary leaders on their performance, on their business strategy. And we were in March, it was March of 2020. And my husband and I were visiting Australia and we were there for 3 weeks and we ended up staying for 2 years because it was March of 2020. And we were those Americans who got stuck abroad.
Wow. And I don't think I knew that.
Yeah. So my son was actually born in Australia. And what's so cool was I had to pivot because prior to 2020, I used to say, when I'm live, I thrive. And I would get most of my coaching clients from going or hosting live events. Well, those weren't happening for one, because of COVID, and for two, because of my visa. So even though we were in Queensland, which was like the Florida of Australia, where as long as you didn't leave the state, you had a pretty normal COVID experience. But I still had to look at how do I generate new business revenue for my company? Because my husband's industry completely shut down. And we were there with our then 3-year-old son. And he was our only one at that point, and I had a family to support. And so we started with doing more content, and then doing discovery calls, and then doubling down on our own podcast that we've had since 2019, the Crown Yourself podcast. And those were great for building the community that we had and reinforcing the values, especially during that time of really high performance in a time of chaos. But we weren't generating any new business revenue. And that was when I remembered an interview that I'd done, a podcast interview that I'd been a guest on in 2019 that had resulted in a $10,000 coaching contract. And I thought, well, what if we double down on podcast guesting? So my team went to work. We started submitting for 100 podcasts a week for 4 weeks.
Wow. I thought I had a pretty hefty commitment to doing podcast guests, but I get it. I totally get it. Okay.
And from that, within 9 months, we did $70,000 of new business revenue. And now it's over $250,000. This year alone, we've done at least $23,000 from just podcast guesting alone. So there is so much power, but it comes from serving and not approaching it from like, I'm going to, close some deals when I go on this podcast. Like, I'm not looking at you, Karen, as like, you're my next potential client. I'm saying, okay, I'm going to deliver and serve your audience as best as possible, give them my tips and strategies, and then develop the relationship between you and I. And then from there, maybe we get cross-refer business. This is how our clients have gone on with Communication Queens to get business even before the podcast distributes. They get clients, they get new customers, they get speaking gigs, they do joint venture partnerships with podcast hosts because they were on the show. So not only does it provide social proof and do you get the extra credibility once the podcast distributes, but the greatest, when you have a real strong strategic match on, and you're going on the right podcast for your business, which most people don't. When you go on the right podcast though, and I'm happy to tell you which ones are not the right.
I really feel like I should be writing things down because in my head, I'm like, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you're able to go on the right podcast for your business that your ideal customer avatar is listening to, you can develop relationship with the podcast host and generate even more business. Like I did, one of the examples is I was on a podcast with a host. And from that, she was like, this podcast was so amazing. Would you come into my membership community and teach these principles in an even greater depth of like a masterclass? And I said, absolutely. And so we created a joint venture partnership where I brought people from my community into her community. And we ended up closing at least, I think it was about like $12,000 in sales from that alone. But it came from me being on a podcast interview and then building the relationship.
Right. I love that so much. So I get that. And I think that one of the things that you get to do, like one of the things that I get to do, because I have a podcast that has guests like you, right? I get to invite, and not everybody wants to do this, but I get to invite them. Like, let's say I've got an event coming up, a promotional event or a marketing event or a launchy type event. I get to say, hey, would you be interested in sending this out to your audience? And what I do is I'll create content that basically says, hey, you might remember Karen. I was on her show a while back. Here's the link. It immediately changes the energy of that conversation from all the things you get from all the people that are promoting other people's stuff. That's just like my good friend, Kimberly, who they don't have any idea if you know them or not, right? Yeah. But this is immediately establishing, no, I really do know this person. And I really do recommend this. And I think it adds a level of depth to those joint ventures and to those conversations. So I love that in theory. But what I want to ask you, I want to get into a lot of the other stuff you talked about. But before we get there, I want to ask you this. Give us some tips on, how are you driving people just from listening, right, to your audience? Do you offer lead magnets? Do you offer, calls? Like, what do you find works best to kind of, because what I tell my clients is this, like, I want you to be interviewed on these podcasts, but what I also don't want is 6 months from now, the people that heard you on that podcast to say, what was that lady's name that I heard on Kim's podcast? Because you didn't give them a way to stay connected to you and follow up with you, because they might not need what you want today, right? But they might in 2 months or 3 months or 4 months, right? So how can you make that authentically and in integrity and in a complete energy of support? kind of capture some of that audience?
Yeah. So my favorite thing is look at the medium first, right? So podcasting is an auditory medium first and foremost. When people are consuming podcasts, they're usually doing something like, and the podcast is on in the background of their life. They're doing their laundry, they're washing their dishes, they're driving the kids to school. So the podcast is there as an accoutrement in the background where they're learning and they're going on a walk, or, they're doing something. So anything that requires like heaps of doing. So for example, one of our clients, when she came to us, she was having people text a number. And I was like, no, that works for speaking gigs in front of a live audience.
Even then, so many people don't want to give you their number, in a environment like that.
Yeah. But think about it, like podcasts, people listen to podcasts when they're driving. We don't need more texting and driving.
Right.
I said, have it be one clear, very simple call to action, auditory medium to auditory medium. So one thing that's the best call to action is if you have a podcast of your own, you direct people to your podcast. And I learned this from Dave Jackson. And Dave Jackson is the founder of the School of Podcasting. Yep. And he said, instead of saying, listen to my podcast and all the places where podcasts are hosted, and then you go into the description and then there's 15 different links for Apple and Overcast and Spotify and all the different. No, you have people go to your website and you have, like, for both my podcasts, so we have Communication Queens and Crown Yourself, and those are for both my businesses. We have crownyourself.com/podcast and communicationqueens.com/podcast. And that way they're going to your site, which then you get to have email capture when they land on it, and they get to subscribe through your site really easily on the platform of their choice versus having to, like, again, text and drive to, like, let me type in, Good Girls Get Rich podcast.
Right.
So an auditory medium to an auditory medium is the best. So if you have an auditory course, even if it's an auditory and visual course, any sort of cross mapping of the representational system. So I'm an NLP master coach. I've been for years. And that's one of the things that I work with my clients in my coaching business. And we all have representational systems that we learn through. And because people are in the auditory representational system, listening, consuming, feeling in their body, listening to the sound waves, then transitioning to a podcast, transitioning to, the call to action being a direct phone call, like not necessarily a phone call, could be a Zoom call or a Calendly link. But I always like to say 2 calls to action. Most people do this by, like, follow me on all the social media sites, and then they list out all their social media sites, and then that's how they're doing it wrong. Because they give away too many things. I say 2 calls to action. 1, direct them to your podcast. If you don't have a podcast, then on your website, for all the podcasts that you're a guest on, have yourwebsite.com/guest-podcasts. And then have all the podcasts that you've been a guest on. And this is how one of our, I interviewed an amazing lawyer, Jay Razook, and he has on his website all the podcasts that he was a guest on. And people who come to him they scope out the other podcasts because they want to build that know, like, and trust, because podcasting is an intimate medium. You have someone literally talking in your ears and in your head, and you feel closer. And I've had people that got on calls with me who've listened to the podcast, and they start, like, totally fangirling, and it's bizarre.
They're like, I feel like I know you already. Like, I feel like I get it. And it's that's why this is so powerful. Yeah. That's why this is so powerful, because we work so hard. For years we've heard you need 10 touches, you need know, like, and trust. That's what a podcast does, right? Yeah. Not only does it attract I love that magnetic approach to it, right? But not only does it attract your perfect people, it also, like, will repel the people that are not perfect, which is just as good. I don't have any desire to talk to people for however long that are not a good fit for me. So if they don't want to work with somebody who's fast talking Jersey, whatever, like, let's find that out up front, But I've also had people, I remember somebody called me up one time and she's like, I'm from New York, blah, blah, blah. I moved to California. My company, I'm listening to your podcast. My company needs your East Coast energy. Like, and I'm like, that's it. I never met her before in my life. Right. Yeah. So I love that you're saying those things. I love that you're saying those things, because this is, it's those little things that people don't think about, right? The medium. And I remember the first time I was interviewed, I had, there was a woman that was doing a show, Career Talk Radio on Sirius XM. And at the time she was doing a lot of guests. She's not doing a lot of guests anymore.
I think I was on her show.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. It's awesome, right? I didn't know who she was, but somebody mentioned me on her show and my like stuff blew up. And I was like, what's going on today? Like, why is everybody like going into my Facebook group and doing all these things? Well, I finally built a relationship with her. But the first time I was on her show was probably the biggest show I was ever on at the time. The first thing I did was like, I need an easy to remember URL for what people, because people are listening to this. They're not sitting at their computer. Like, I need an easy to remember URL that I can send people to. I didn't have a podcast at the time, and I wanted to send them to something to kind of capture them. So and URLs are $10 a year, so I was like, I'm going to buy an easy to remember URL for that same thing. And so many people go to KarenYankovich.com/this-that, blah, blah, blah. So like you, I have KarenYankovich.com/podcast gets you to the show, but also goodgirlsgetrich.com also sends you to my website podcast page. Do you know what I mean? For the same reason, whatever you're going to remember, I want you to be captured. And I guess the point of asking you this question is I want people to remember that. Think about your own experience in life. You heard this person, you can't remember who it was or where you heard them or whatever. If they're not coming into your email regularly or their podcast is getting downloaded to your podcast app, you are going to forget who they are. We're so overloaded with information. So that's such good advice. So tell me then a little bit about the other ways that people can profit from guest podcasting, right? So now we're capturing their attention, and that's just somebody listening who wants to follow you, right? What other ways can we capture profit opportunities from guest podcasting?
So I like to think of it from the lens of the problem of the podcaster. And so in any relationship, and especially in any sales relationship or relationship of influence, you're providing a solution for a problem. So the top 3 problems that podcasters have is they don't have great guests. Like they struggle to find great guests because people may email them, or like I get a ton of pitches per week. And I'm like, we just recently instituted a policy that we're no longer accepting people who just want to empower women, because that's not enough of a qualification. Like, we need to see that you actually have results empowering women, rather than actually just like, oh, I really want to just do this and get my voice out. And like, that's great. But we have 230 episodes now on the Crown Yourself podcast of people who are inspiring women, and also doing something, leveraging that in their business and doing that as a model.
Right.
So we get a ton of like not so great pitches per week.
Yeah, as do I. And I just want to step in for a second and say, this is why the strategies we teach are so critical, because we're teaching build relationships with the podcast host, listen to the shows, like be more intentional about who you want to be on. I get the same as you. I get pitches and then repeat pitches from people that have never listened to the show, are such not a fit for the show. And frankly, even if I look at it and it looks amazing, I don't know them. So it's much less likely that I'm going to even take a cold pitch than somebody that took the time to listen to the show and make at least this much of an attempt to build a relationship with me. Because so the good news is there's so much opportunity out there because there's so many podcasts out there. But the bad news is there's a lot of people out there that want to be on your show, and I just get too many. So there's the right shows are out there for you. Just go about it in a more intentional way, in a more structured way. And you'll have much better success, and take you less time because you don't have to pitch 4,000 people.
Yeah. Right? And that's also the great part about working with an agency who's building relationships with podcasters. Yes. Like, we just had a global top 200 podcaster in entrepreneurship say that our pitches were the best that she's ever received. And because she knows me and we're friends, she knows I'm not going to pitch her BS people that aren't a fit for her show, because I respect her.
Because not only that, and this is another reason why a podcast service like yours, which I want you to talk about at some point, let's not forget to talk about that. Not only that, sometimes even if it seems like a good fit, and then you get to the interview and it's pulling teeth, right? The conversations are just not going well. And I try to make them at ease and things like that, but sometimes you just can't. So if you have somebody, an agency or somebody you know and trust that refers you that person, you can trust that they've already done that, or you're never going to take the next person that they send, right? Yeah. So if I'm going to take somebody from a podcast agency, it's going to be from an agency I know, like you, and there's, one or two other agencies that, or not even agencies, sometimes they're just PR agencies, right? But I know if they sent them to me that they've already know that it's going to be a great fit for me. And I can trust that. And frankly, I'm all about making my life easier, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's that you're solving one problem in that way for the podcaster.
Yeah.
And that like the pitches from an agency, because of the relationship built, can be just super powerful, like you said, because it is about the relationship. And so to circle back to your question on profiting from guest podcasting. So if we're solving the problem for a guest, so say, for example, you go on a podcast, maybe you pitched it them yourself or your agency pitched you, and you go on and you blow that podcaster host mind. Like they're like, oh my God, the amount of value that you delivered, I'm amazed. And you say, hey, my friend Jane is also does similar to what I do, but she's also, does this modality a little differently, and I think should be a really great fit. So by you providing a referral and generosity, that can be a great way to create reciprocity in the relationship, where then JV partnerships can manifest and cross referral businesses does happen because you start off the relationship on a foundation of generosity and reciprocity. So that's one. Number two, the problem that most podcasters also face is monetization. So very few podcasts are actually monetized. Most people, even though if they have thousands of downloads, sometimes they don't either choose to monetize with outside third-party sponsors, or they just don't think they have the number of downloads that they need to actually get sponsorship, which is ridiculous because I know some podcasts that have had like 1,000 downloads and they get sponsorships. So it's possible, but because if you approach it from solving that podcaster's problem, what we do is, both as an agency and what we recommend for our clients, is that you provide the podcaster with an affiliate link. So when any of our clients go on to a podcast, we tell the podcaster, hey, use our link, become an affiliate of the Communication Queens agency. When you are an affiliate of the Communication Queens agency, you get 10%. If any of your listeners like hear our services or hear our client and they are like, oh, I want to get booked on more podcasts too, then you have those links that you can provide them in the description, because the client was a referral from there. So you get 10% commission or 50% commission for any digital products, memberships, or courses. That's just how we structure it. And then for me, like when I go on podcasts for my coaching company, we also say become an affiliate. So then they have two opportunities to be an affiliate. They can be an affiliate of our communications agency, and they can be an affiliate of the Crown Yourself in our coaching, which also has the same affiliate structure. And so we recommend that our clients also provide some sort of affiliate kickback, and where they give the podcaster the links.
This is gold. I hope everybody's listening to this. This is gold.
Because then the podcaster has an opportunity to generate revenue by referring you, and they'll be more inclined to promote your episode because they have a possibility of making income from it.
Yes. You know what? That's just such gold. So the way our podcast process works is we have an application or whatever. And then once the episode is, once the guest is accepted, we send them an intake form and say, do all, here's the things you need to know. Here, the date's booked. Here's a form we need you to complete. Give us your social media links, your bio, your headshot, all that stuff. And in that we say, and is there an affiliate program that Karen should register for? We have done about, I don't know, like this is going to be somewhere in the 300s episodes since 2017. And I'm going to tell you, if 50 of those people have given me that opportunity, that's a lot. And almost everybody says, and sometimes they'll say, well, just have them use a code or whatever, but it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. So, and all I have to do now, because I'm putting your links in anyway. Right. Yeah. I'm putting your links in anyway. All I'm doing is, instead of going to, goodgirlsgetrich.com, which you wouldn't be, I would go to communicationsqueens.com. You would still see communicationsqueens.com, but there'd be a little piece of code with it that tells, Kimberly, that this came from Karen. So yes, it's nice for me as a podcast host, right, to have this other way to monetize. But as Karen, the podcast, I wish more people asked me for my affiliate link. You know what I mean? When they interview me, because it brings more business to my program. Yeah. So it's so crazy to me that is not done more ubiquitously in this industry. It might even 50 might even be a high number. It might be like 10%, maybe 10%.
Yeah. We've had about 10% have affiliate links for And I'm like, just like when you give an affiliate, so we actually put that into our intake form of like asking people for their affiliate links so we can sign up so that I just think in creating, how many ways can you create a win-win-win? You win, your audience wins, your customers win, we win, like we all win together, and that rising tide lifts all boats mentality.
Yes.
And it's like, I think it's one of the ways that we've gotten on so many podcasts. Like I think I've done over 300 interviews, and it's because we lead with the fact that like by having me on, you have a potential to monetize.
Right.
Even and like one of our clients, Kashif Khan, like he is doing webinars. And so he goes on a podcast, and then he has had great success with doing a joint venture webinar that draws people into his program, and the podcaster gets an affiliate commission.
Right.
So it's the affiliate, like that is gold. The second way you can monetize is in the 15 to 20, in like the 5 minutes before and after the conversation. So it's about like when you have a podcast interview, block out some space, 10 to 15 minutes, so that you have buffer time, because in that buffer time, there's so much potential to build on the relationship. And so, I mean, you're going to hear me ask this question when we're done. Like when we stop recording, I'm going to say, what did you love about this episode? So you get the podcaster in a positive frame of mind, reflecting on what they loved about the episode. And then I say, is there anything beyond promoting the episode that I can do to contribute to your success? And I like to make this and be very clear that I'm like, this is not like you think I'm going to like be great for, you coming on as a client. I'm like, is it a referral? Is it a connection? Is it a tool? Like I have my network is your network. Like who can I introduce you to based on this, this experience of the relationship that we're building? And I asked those 2 questions, and those 2 questions have generated so much referral business for us.
I love that. Oh my gosh. It's so important. And this is at the heart of everything that we teach here. And She's Linked Up because it is micro targeted and deepening what you're already doing instead of being all over the place and burning yourself out trying to be a million different places at the same time and a million different things to a million different people, right? Like just do this. And here's what else I know. I can tell you that when people book a call or inquire about joining our program, I can almost always know where, like I ask where they came from, right? But I almost always know where they came from. Like they don't fall out of the sky, right? So if they say, I listened to your podcast, I know that they wanted, they're like, no. I just need to know which program is right. They're in, right? They're not saying, I don't sell people anyway, but I don't have to sell them, right? I say that because this is how, again, it becomes more magnetic and it makes the whole process so much simpler for everyone, right? For everyone. You don't have to feel like, I don't know how to sell, or you don't have to sell, right? You're just creating this experience for them where they're already getting, like I say, my She's Linked Up community starts here on the podcast, not the first time you give me your credit card. It starts here because that's when people start to get to know me. And like you said, I am always making intros to people because they remember that and they will start making intros to me. And that's that rising tide, right? And that's what that is, I will say that I feel like the online world has gotten really noisy with the pandemic and with everything. It got so noisy that we have to figure out a way to stand out. And I think a podcast helps you do that because again, if I also know, like, let me just take this to the next step. If I also know that some of my best clients have come from my podcast, then my question is, how do I get more people to listen to my podcast? How do I do that? I guest on other people's podcasts because they're already listening to podcasts. Isn't that a better use of my time than spending, $1 million on Facebook ads?
And do you want the pro trick?
Yes.
So
I totally want the pro trick.
We all have objections, right? When we go into a sales conversation, there's the common 4 of like money, time, it's not right for me. But then there's also those like specific objections. Like for example, with our agency, it's like the specific objection is like, I'm not tech savvy. Okay, well, and so I always you can address the objections if you understand the beliefs of the subconscious beliefs that are driving the objections. You address the objections in the content that you share on a podcast interview. So we did this with one of our clients, Dr. Tiffany Smith, and where she, on her call, she was having, she's a functional nutrition psychiatric nurse practitioner. And she was having people still come to her because she is trained in both allopathic and more holistic medicine. She was still having people coming to her discovery calls, like wanting just a pill to have a quick fix. And that's not what she does.
Right.
And so we said, on your podcasts, when you're going on podcast interviews, make sure you're addressing this belief so that by the time somebody gets to going on a discovery call or a strategy call with you, they're not looking for those objection. You're not getting even presented with the type of people that are just looking for that quick pill fix. You're getting people who understand that there's probably going to be a 3 to 6 month commitment of a dietary lifestyle and holistic changes that they're going to have to make to get the results that they desire, to get to the root of the issue.
Right.
And so she saw a dramatic increase and change by just addressing these common misconceptions. And that's a powerful thing. If you look in your business or your industry, what are those things that people come to you thinking, maybe it's a mistake that they're making or a wrong expectation that they have of your services or what they think that they're going to get from you? For example, with our podcast agency, one of the common things is, I'll just do it when I finish my book. I'll start working with you when my book is done. Because we get a lot of authors coming to us.
Right.
And I said, do you have a landing page? Because most podcasts are, if you're going for the top 5% ranked podcasts. So I'm going to break down podcast math for a hot second, just so that you're clear.
Please.
90% of podcasts are not worth your time. 90% of podcasts do not produce more than 10 episodes, and they're not consistently producing. They may show on Apple Podcasts as 5.5 million podcasts, but 90% of them are not actually continuously producing. So you want to only focus on the podcasts that are producing. We have a 5-30-90 rule. They have to have 5 reviews. They have produced over 30 episodes, and they produce every 90 days. That's our basic rule for any podcast that we submit to, because that automatically elevates them into the top 10% of podcasts. That being said, when you are going on those podcasts, you want to make sure of what are the things that you can address that are the common objections. So when we talk about the big objection for us is authors come and they'll say, I'll start when my book is done. And so what we can say is we are booking clients right now for the top 5% ranked podcasts. Because once you make it to the top 10%, then you have the ranking of the podcast, which means they're in the top 10%, 5%, 1% of all the top 10% of active podcasts. So the cream of the crop. Mm-hmm. Well, those podcasts are already booking out for 2025, and we're recording this in May. They've been booking into 2025 since February of this year. So starting getting booked now, if you think about it, when the timeline for podcasting, it's a long game strategy. So on podcasts where I talk about podcasting, like this one, because I'm going very meta, demonstrating and explaining at the same time. When you are thinking about getting booked on podcasts and you want to go for those top podcasts that really build your authority in your niche, you need to start now, even before the book is even done. Because by the time that the podcast is booked, recorded, that doesn't mean that the episode is going to be distributed in a timely manner.
Right.
Because Karen, you and I recorded a podcast episode for Communication Queen, and we're booked until September. So your episode is coming out in September.
Right.
And we recorded it last month.
Right. We're recording in May. I think you're scheduled to come out in July. So we're a little bit tighter on that, but same. Yeah. And mainly that's because I needed to ramp up again. You know what I mean? And because I was booked so far out that I pulled back, and then I was like, time to do that again. Right?
Exactly.
So
and that's the thing that you want to think about when you're thinking of going on other people's podcasts. And so by addressing this objection up front and on podcasts, I can pre-frame the objection of, well, why don't I just wait to get started when my book is done? And I'm like, when your book is done, you're going to be booking out for podcasts 6 months from then, and maybe a year from then, it's going to be distributed, depending upon the size and scope of the podcast.
Great information. This is such great information. And to just circle back, let's just remember why we're talking about that right now. We're talking about that right now because what Kimberly's saying is this is how you monetize, right? I talked about the fact that I love when people say I'm a podcast listener because and that it also repels people that are not a good fit, right? Not only because here's the thing, what happens if you are not doing that and you're getting people booking on your calendar that are not a good fit, and listen, it's going to still happen, right? We're not, it's not perfect, but every time it happens, number one, it's probably a waste of your time. And I'm all about not wasting my time. And number two, that's where you have to sell as opposed to just have that conversation. Is this a right fit? Which of my programs is the right fit? Right. So it is so much more work to be creating a push marketing strategy as opposed to an attraction marketing strategy. And so this is what Kimberly's discussing is a tip to be, feeding the objections that you're going to that you commonly have to overcome on enrollment calls in your podcast and in the interviews you're doing. That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you can just make a list, like go through your sales calls, make a list of like, what are the common objections that you're seeing and how can you address those in the form of metaphor, on which metaphors can be like case studies from past clients. Right. You can address those as like, oh, well, we had an author who came on and because she started early, we were able to, right when her book came out, she had podcast interviews versus we're having to wait 6 months for the interview to come out to actually be promoting her book. Which by the way, if you are an author, like promote your book, get the landing page up, pre-sell that book like crazy beforehand, just because, especially on podcast interviews, those are the highest converting. Oh my gosh. In fact, did you know, Karen, that 42% of millennial podcast listeners report purchasing based on the recommendations of the host?
Wow. I believe that. I have an Amazon cart full of things that people have recommended to me that sometimes I purchase immediately and sometimes they sit there until I see when they need to get purchased, when they need to actually arrive at my door. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Same. Like
and even Amazon, even on my Amazon links on my page, they're affiliate links. I mean, maybe maybe I'll buy a cup of coffee from the money I made from Amazon. Like I don't want anybody to think I'm taking, like Bali vacations from what I make on Amazon. I'm barely gonna get a cup of coffee, but why not do that? If you're an entrepreneur, have those income streams from wherever you can.
Yeah. And it's about looking at all the different opportunities and ways to leverage it. And podcasts, just the medium itself, aside, like the numbers don't even come close in any other social media marketing platform, not even LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the only one that comes close. But 66% of podcast listeners have a college degree or higher, so they're highly educated. 66% also are making over 100K per year annual household income or more. I think LinkedIn is like 51, maybe 61% for that. So the podcast listener audience, they are educated, they are affluent. And so you also have to demonstrate on a podcast interview a level of mastery. Like I said, like we have a top 2% podcast with our Crown Yourself podcast, and we're no longer accepting people who quote, just want to empower women. Not that empowering women is like a bad thing. I'm like all about it. And we need something more after so many episodes. We need people who are actually demonstrating it, not just desire. Like one of my friends, April Petraeus, who has I think it's a Story Brand podcast or Storyteller podcast. She said that she got a pitch that was just like, I think I'd be a great guest for your podcast, and she was like, why?
Right. Who are you?
Who are you and why? Like, so one of the things that when you go on podcasts, like really consider the respect of the audience. And that is because a podcaster like you, Karen, like you have deeply invested into your audience. And you know that your audience, if they're listening to your podcast, they are probably more likely to invest in your business. So anyone that you bring into your circle of becoming like being on your show as a guest is a highly vetted process. And you want to make sure, like I know global top 100 podcasters who are like, they will chuck an episode if the guest makes it all about themselves.
Yep.
And
I've done that.
And you have to be able to look at it from the perspective of how can I add the most amount of value to this person's audience? Because I started out in theater. That was like my jam. I did musical theater. Like I could sing Defying Gravity like every day. My sons, I sing it as a lullaby now to my sons.
Oh, I love that.
And in theater, you learn very quickly that it's not the production that's the hardest part. Like people are happy to participate in a production because they're probably getting paid a little bit of money or they're supporting it. But the hardest part is actually getting the audience there. I mean, I've done shows way back when I was like 19 years old in little black box theaters in Los Angeles where there was like 2 people in the audience and we were like, oh crap, we got to ramp up the marketing for the show because that's the hardest part to build. And so as a guest, when you go on anyone's show, the number one question I recommend asking, and I didn't ask this for you, Karen, because we've already had discussions about your audience and who they are and how they are, but ask like, describe your audience to me. Because I know if I'm going onto a podcast, like especially for my Crown Yourself coaching business, there's going to be different tips and strategies that I'm going to say if the podcast tells me, well, they're mostly newbie entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, they don't really have a team. I'm going to be giving different strategies on growing a high performance business and creating leverage in their business so they can have more time, freedom, and space. Versus if I'm talking to a podcast of established entrepreneurs who have teams of 15, 30, 50 people where they are like, I'm going to be discussing different strategies. Right. And so you have to be able to tailor your communication to who you're speaking to. And that's a huge piece of like understanding the audience that you're going on. And the podcaster honestly is going to be the biggest reflection because like attracts like of who their audience is.
I love that. Talk to me a little bit, because we do have to wrap soon, but so 2 more things. First, talk to me a little bit about, all right, I've been a guest on your show. What is the expectation as the host as to what the guest will do as promotion? And what, if you want to be a guest on more shows, what can you do post release of the show to help ensure that and to help ensure that the most people get to hear that show?
Yeah. So promotion. That is the number one thing I see most podcast hosts be frustrated with their guests is that they don't even share the show. And so what we do as an agency is we produce at least 5 social media assets for our CEO clients because typically what they're coming to us for is leverage. Like we help to make their lives easier. We get them booked on the podcast and then we provide them the social media so that they can then leverage that podcast to build their own social credibility. So you can use tools like Opus Pro, which basically takes the video and then gives you 15 different clips. You can, after we're finished with this podcast, even before the podcast releases, like we took a screenshot before and I'm going to post it on LinkedIn and then I'm going to write you a little LinkedIn review. Like, oh my gosh, I was on Karen's Good Girls Get Rich podcast and she's so amazing. And just be in their space promoting what they do and lift them up before the podcast even releases. Like one of the things that we do with our agency clients is we modeled this from Hollywood. So when I was 17, I was working, I was interning at a big Hollywood agency.
Cool.
And yeah, I learned a lot. I had no idea that I wanted to start an agency back then, but like I got to intern. And like one of the things that you do as like a Hollywood agent is when your clients book a show, you post about it when the NDA clears, basically, when the studio says you can post about it. So as soon as you can share about it, you share about that booking. Hey, got clients booked on a commercial, got clients booked on a TV show, etc. You share about that before the show even comes out, because that builds up the credibility for the next level of shows that they can get on. So then you can then have that leverage and leverage the show and say, oh, I was on this show. Now we can get her booked on that show, because people like to work with people who are hot commodities.
Right.
And that's not saying that people are commodities, but if we're to look at it from a sales perspective.
We run businesses, right? That's a word we should be comfortable with.
Yeah. Right. So we run businesses. And so being aware of who you are and how you're selling as a commodity, and especially for actors, like you are the product. Like
Right.
the same is true with being the entrepreneur and the visionary
Right.
leader and the CEO. You may not be the product. You may be delivering the product or the service, giving your coaching services or consulting or the book, but you are the ambassador for the project.
Right. The face
So
of the
you're the
business. Right.
face of the business. So being able to put yourself out there, and people like to be attached to moving things,
Mhm.
like things that are moving
Right.
trains, moving objects.
Right.
People like to be in the momentum because money loves momentum. And
Mhm.
so when you can post about, hey, I got booked on this show. Hey, I just recorded this show. Hey, the show is dropped. Then you have 3 touch points already of the show, of the benefit of you being on the show, cross promoting the show. And also you can drive traffic to the show even before the show even airs. And so then you have a podcaster who, it goes back to that reciprocity and generosity, who's like, holy crap, like who is this person? They are sharing about me
Yep.
multiple times. And that's how you can start to build that relationship, because in any relationship, no one likes to be in a relationship with a taker. Like we call them
Yes.
narcissists. And
Yes.
a lot of people, unfortunately, when they start going on podcasts, because I had a call with a woman who was like, I went on 40 podcasts like this past month. I said, did any of them convert into an ROI? And she looked at me like, and she's like, oh, well, they haven't distributed yet. I'm like, that's a moot point. Like you
Mhm.
can make money off going on a podcast interview before it even distributes. But what the problem was that she was treating a podcast interview like a one night stand rather than building an actual quality relationship.
Right. Right. So important. So important. So good. All right. So Kimberly, tell us how we can find you. What have you got going on for the rest of this year? By the way, one more thing before you say that.
Yeah.
You talked about Opus as a
Mhm.
tool. We're actually recording this in StreamYard. And did you know StreamYard now does that too? It part of the service, it pops out like 10 or 6
Amazing.
little mini video reels, right? Like how cool is that? So like it's just we just have to know what exists, and the post production of podcasts is just getting so much simpler in this world of AI that we are living in.
Mhm.
But that's a whole nother conversation. Tell us what's going on for you for the rest of 2024 and what we should be looking for and where we can find you, and give me some links to put in the show notes. So when you stop driving your car and you come back to goodgirlsgetrich.com or KarenYankovich.com/podcast, you know how to find Kimberly and dive deeper into what she's doing.
Yeah. So if you love this conversation and you're interested in more high performance coaching for your business, head on over to crownyourself.com/podcast and subscribe to the Crown Yourself podcast. And if you are interested in learning how to leverage podcasts for your business growth, head on over to communicationqueens.com/podcast. And will be offered the opportunity to book your 100K profit from guest podcasting call with me. And the big thing that I'm super excited is this year in Q4, we are coming out with our book, Make Every Podcast Want You, How to Become So Radically Interesting You'll Barely Keep from Interviewing Yourself. And so that will be also available on Communication
Awesome.
Queens.
Awesome. That's when is that expected to be live?
September.
Oh my gosh. Well, that's perfect because I think that's when my interview with you is on your show is coming out.
Yeah.
So I can promote the ever living heck out of your book. I want one. Just so you know, put me on that list. I want
You got
one.
it.
Awesome. This has been great. Kimberly. This is such important information because I just want to kind of reiterate, obviously, if you're in a position to bring somebody like Kimberly and her team in to help you with this, you absolutely 100% should. Right. And between now and then, just start doing this. Start taking these tips, start implementing them. You know, I don't know if I've talked about this on the show. Maybe if I have, it's like once or twice. I was in I don't know if this is a great story or not, but I was in a bar one time, sitting in a bar, and there was this woman sitting next to me, and she just was a whiner. She was just a whiner, and I had like this much tolerance for whiners. But I was talking to her because she was friendly and nice and whatever, and I was with a couple friends, and she was just whining. She hated her job, she hated her life, blah blah blah. So I, being who I am, finally said to her, "All right, well, what would you do if you could do anything in the world with your business and your career? What would you do?" And she's like, "I would love to have a radio show. I'd be so good. She started talking about all these topics she wanted to talk about. I was like, Okay. I'm like, give me your phone. I go, here you go. Like, do it. Like, do it. It's free. You know what I mean? Create, like, just pick a topic, talk about it for 10 or 15 minutes, and you've just created your first radio show. Like, it's a podcast. The world we live in now, there are no obstacles to this. There are
Mhm.
no obstacles to this. As you start doing it and you implement the tips that Kimberly gave you and you start to monetize it, then you 100% want to bring in a team like Kimberly's team, because it accelerates it. And frankly, I don't clean my own bathroom because I can, right? But I don't want to, right?
Right?
So when I could afford somebody to do that, I brought somebody in to do that. That's what I do with my business as well. So, and you all should as well. So thank you so much for being here, Kimberly. I really appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to your book. And those of you that do not know who I am, hopefully you subscribe to this show by now. And if you loved this conversation and you want to know a little bit more about how to build those relationships, because even when you're working with an agency, right, it doesn't mean you don't have also some responsibility. I'm not even going to call it responsibility, but you can put a little fuel under the work that you're investing in to help make their job easier by building relationships on LinkedIn, by creating a LinkedIn profile that makes you look worthy of being on these podcasts. And again, showing up and knowing exactly how to use these platforms to build these systems in for yourself. So grab a spot on our calendar at KarenYankovich.com/call. And I'm happy to chat with you about what that looks like. And in the meantime, we'll see you back here next week with another episode. Thanks for being here, Kimberly.
Thank you so much for having me, Karen. It was such a pleasure.